Nothing happens in isolation, and this book subsequently was itself an influence on what came after it. Hello, and if you haven't been here, welcome to my channel. Today we're going to be reading a book called The Cathedral and the Bazaar by Eric S. Raymond. It's history of open source and closed source software development, and yeah, that's what we're going to be doing. So here we go. Well, hello. I want to try something a little bit different today. I figured we'd read a book, so I have this book here. The Cathedral and the Bazaar, Musings on Linux and Open Source by an Accidental Revolutionary. And, the way I figure it, we're not reading, enough wisdom of the ancients, you might say. So, I just thought I'd give it a try, and I'd read this book. So it's written by Eric S. Raymond, and the dedication is to the memory of Robert Anson Heinlein for the many lessons he taught me to respect competence, to value and defend freedom, and especially that specialization is for insects. For those of you who don't know, Robert Heinlein wrote some classic science fiction. One of his two famous, perhaps most famous, I don't know if most, but two works of his that you may have heard of are what was it? Have spacesuit and will travel, and he also wrote The Man Who Sold the Moon. I believe that's correct. Anyway, the foreword. Freedom is not an abstract concept in business. The success of an industry is almost directly related to the degree of freedom the suppliers and the customers of that industry enjoy. Just compare the innovation in the U.S. telephone business since AT&T lost its monopoly control over American consumers with the previously slow pace of innovation when those customers had no freedom to choose. The world's best examples of the benefits of freedom in business is a comparison of the computer hardware business and the computer software business. In computer hardware, where freedom reigns for both suppliers and consumers alike on a global scale, the industry generates the fastest innovation in product and consumer value the world has ever seen. In the computer software industry, on the other hand, change is measured in decades. The Office Suite, the 1980s killer application, wasn't challenged until the 1980s with the introduction of the web browser and server. So, open source software brings to the computer software and industry even greater freedom than the hardware manufacturers and consumers have enjoyed. Computer languages are called languages because they are just that. They enable the educated members of our society, in this case programmers, to build and communicate ideas that benefit the other members of our society, including other programmers. Legally restricting access to the knowledge of the infrastructure that our society increasingly relies on via the proprietary binary-only software licenses our industry historically has used results in less freedom and slower innovation. Open source represents some revolutionary concepts being thrown at an industry that thought it had all of its fundamental structures worked out. It gives customers control over the technologies they use instead of enabling the vendors to control their customers through restricting access to the code behind the technologies. Supplying open source tools to the market will require new business models, but by delivering unique benefits to the market, those companies that develop the business models will be very successful, competing with companies that attempt to retain control over their customers. There have always been two things that would be required if open source software was to materially change the world. One was for open source software to become widely used, and the other was that the benefits this software development model supplied to its users had to be communicated and understood. This is Eric Raymond's great contribution to the success of the open source software revolution, to the adoption of Linux-based operating systems, and to the success of open source users and companies that supply them. Eric's ability to explain clearly, effectively, and accurately the benefits of this revolutionary software development model has been central to the success of this revolution. That foreword was written by Bob Young, Chairman and CEO of Red Hat. In case you don't know, they produced Fedora, a Linux distribution. So he is making a case here. He says that freedom is not an abstract concept in business, and that innovation and success is directly related to freedom. Now, he may or may not be right. I don't know, but that's the case he's making. And we all need to approach these things and decide if what we're reading is true and correct. And some things, even if you don't agree with the person, sometimes they can start off with what is a truism in order to sort of connect their case, what they're trying to claim, to what we both agree on. As he says, just compare the innovation in the U.S. telephone business since AT&T lost its monopoly control over American consumers with the previously slow pace of innovation when the consumers had no freedom to choose. So, in case you didn't know, after Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone, that grew into a monolithic business that ended up being called AT&T. American Telephone and Telegraph Corporation. And the United States government eventually decided that, these monopolies, large monopolies, were not good for the American consumer. Standard Oil was another one. And so they broke them up into smaller entities. And so, although we don't have many landline telephone companies now, any remaining, for a while there, telephone companies were often regional or organized differently. And he's suggesting that after that monopoly was broken up, that led to additional innovation and better prices for the consumer, because they could go and choose the company they bought service from and that kind of stuff. And that may be true. So the fundamental premise of this book is it's trying to compare and contrast the two models of software development. The Cathedral, what he calls the Cathedral, is the closed source model, where you don't get to see, as the end user, what causes this action to happen. On the other hand, the Bazaar model, as he posits it, is basically the idea that many people, the more eyes you have on a problem, the better and faster you can solve that problem. And that is the fundamental case for having open source and all these different projects that are free and freely available, freely copyable. Because if it's not closed source, you can't really prevent people from, sharing it around. That's perhaps one of the big problems with it, if you want to make that case. So on to the preface. Why should you care? The book in your hands is about the behavior and culture of computer hackers. It collects a series of essays originally meant for programmers and technical managers. The obvious and entirely fair question for you, but the potential reader to ask is, why should I care? The most obvious answer to this question is that computer software is an increasingly critical factor in the world economy and in the strategic calculations of businesses. That you have opened this book at all means you are almost certainly familiar with many of today's truisms about the information economy, the digital age, and the wired world. I will not rehearse them here. I will simply point out that any significant advance in our understanding of how to build better quality, more reliable software has tremendous implications that are growing more tremendous by the day. The essays in this book did not invent such a fundamental advance, but they do describe one: open source software, the process of systematically harnessing open development and decentralized peer review to lower costs and improve software quality. Open source software is not a new idea. Its traditions go back to the beginnings of the internet 30 years ago. But only recently have technical and market forces converged to draw it out of a niche role. Today, the open source movement is bidding strongly to define the computing infrastructure of the next century. For anyone who relies on computers, that makes it an important thing to understand. So did you understand the case made there? Basically, he's saying open source, as opposed to, usually the straw man that open source people, at least, back in the 90s, used to posit was Microsoft. They thought Microsoft was the quintessential, oppositional force to their ideas. In any case, he's saying that open source software is going to be driving a lot of the innovation into the next century, which here we are in 2024. So yeah, would you say that that's a correct assessment? Are we using a lot of open project, open SSL, open? There's even video games that have been rebuilt to be open sourced. So it's up to you to evaluate and decide whether or not you think his claim is correct there. I just referred to the open source movement that hints. Continuing, I just referred to the open source movement that hints at other and perhaps more ultimately interesting reasons for the reader to care. The idea of open source has been pursued, realized, and cherished over 30 years by a vigorous tribe of partisans native to the internet. These are the people who proudly call themselves hackers, not as the term is now abused by journalists to mean a computer criminal, but in its true and original sense of an enthusiast, an artist, a tinkerer, a problem solver, and an expert. So, I don't know how many of you will remember, but back in the mid '90s, or a lot of people would have who worked with computers as a hobby would have had a bit of a chip on their shoulder, or an inferiority complex, because they felt like they were being cast as potential criminals by the powers that be, simply because they were interested in technology and trying to understand how it worked. And most of these people understood that going places that they shouldn't, that other people didn't want them to go on the internet was something you shouldn't do. Nevertheless, they may have had the skill to do so, and You know, whereas some people, some bad actors who they felt were giving them a bad name, would go out and do things that were nefarious. And you know, honestly, at this point in history, I think we have a black market economy. I mean, the dark web and all of these all this information that we have out there, all the stolen data for sale if you want to go and find it. You know, that the fact of the matter is that people will engage in bad behavior when there's money available, and you know, you can't stop them. The essence of morality is that we restrict ourselves. You know, you can't have a free society and have good behavior unless we each all individually choose to restrict our own selves and refrain from engaging in certain behaviors and activities because we know that not doing those things is better for society. We all have a moral obligation in that concern, and the only way society is actually going to work, you know, well for everybody is if we each individually choose to restrict ourselves, and rather than requiring some larger power and authority to come in and prevent us from doing evil. We need to do that ourselves individually. I'm gonna go ahead and take a break here. All right, I'm back. I'm gonna try to get mostly through this preface here, and then I'll wrap up this video and go ahead and just be done with that. And if I continue doing this, maybe next time we'll get into the first chapter. But you know, you don't want to miss these prefaces and stuff like that. Sometimes they can be really interesting in them themselves. So, all right. So here, where were we? The tribe of hackers, after decades spent in obscurity struggling against hard technical problems and the far greater weight of mainstream indifference and dismissal, has recently begun to come into its own. They built the internet. They built Unix. They built the World Wide Web. They are building Linux and open source software today. And following the great internet explosion of the mid-1990s, the rest of the world is finally figuring out that it should have been paying more attention to them all along. The hacker culture and its successes pose, by example, some fundamental questions about human motivation. So we were just talking about electronics, computers, and software, and now we're talking about the fundamentals of human motivation. Now, is that too much? Is that surprising? Do you believe him? Is that what kind of a man thinks that these things relate to the fundamental motivations of a human? You know, the hacker culture and its successes pose, by example, some fundamental questions about human motivation, the organization of work, the future of professionalism, and the shape of the firm. So he's talking about some specific things. What motivates us? How do we organize the things that we do? What does it mean to be a professional? You know, how do you organize a company? You know, these were all questions that he's saying were reevaluated in light of the computer revolution of the second half of the 20th century. And about how all of these things will change and evolve in the information-rich post-scarcity economy. Post-scarcity economy? So what does he mean there? Well, if you'll forgive me, a lot of these computer nerds who grew up in the second half of the 20th century, they were real big fans of Star Trek. And if you'll remember Star Trek, they have the replicator, and there's no money, and everybody's got as much as they want and everything they need. And there was just this idea that we're gonna figure out how to make sure that everybody has enough, right? And so he's predicting in the 20th century and beyond, we're going to be a post-scarcity economy. Now, do you realistically think that that's going to happen? It's for you to think about. And how all these things will change and evolve in the information-rich post-scarcity economies of the 21st century and beyond. The hacker culture also, arguably, prefigures some profound changes in the way humans will relate to and reshape their economic surroundings. This should make what we know about the hacker culture of interest to anyone else who will have to live and work in the future. This book is a collection of essays that was originally published on the internet. A Brief History of Hackerdom is originally from 1992, but has since been regularly updated and revised, and the others were written between February 1997 and May 1999. They were somewhat revised and expanded for the first edition in October of 1999, and updated again for this second edition of January 2001. So he's dating where all of these, when all these thoughts and ideas came out of someone and came onto paper. When they started being, formalized, and, they weren't just sort of, vague concepts rattling around in a collective consciousness. But somebody actually wrote them down and said, this is what we mean. This is what, and because this book was, relatively successful, you can generally say that there at least was a section of society that agreed with them and adopted those definitions and those constructs. But no real concerted attempt has been made to remove technicalia or make them more accessible, e.g., dumb them down for a general audience. I think it is more respectful to puzzle and challenge an audience than to bore and insult it. If you have difficulty with particular technical or historical points or the odd computer acronym, feel free to skip ahead. The whole, and that's a good point. When you're reading a book, it's your book. If it's not benefiting you, then what are you reading it for? You're reading it for a purpose. This is not a classroom assignment. You don't just have to get through it. If you're not getting something valuable out of it, then it's honestly a waste of time. So if you want to start from the back of the book and read the chapters in reverse order, or if you only want to read every other chapter, or if you only want to read the first page of a chapter, it's your book. You can absorb information any way you want. But I would point out that the value of the written word is that somebody spent some time over this. They spent the time to compose it and to arrange words in a fashion that they were comfortable with, that they felt was truly communicating whatever message it was that they were trying to communicate. So when somebody writes something down, when you have an actual book written by an actual human, they're kind of serious. They mean what they say, and, you can get a lot out if you try to figure out, well, why did they write that down? Why did they say it that way? It's almost like, code cracking if you want to, but what you're cracking is human psychology. Who was this person? Why did they write that? Why did they think it was important? Why did they put those words in that particular order? Would somebody else have written it the same way? My recommendation on how to read a book. There you go. The whole does tell a story, and you may find that what you learn later makes sense of what puzzled you earlier. The reader should also understand that these essays are evolving documents into which I periodically merge the distilled results of feedback from people who write to comment on or correct them. While I alone remain responsible for any errors in this book, it has benefited from a peer review process very like that which it describes for software, and incorporates contributions from people too numerous to list here. The versions printed here are not fixed or final forms, rather they should be considered reports from a continuing inquiry in which many members of the culture they describe are active participants. Finally, I must at least try to express my delight and amazement and gratitude for the many people and the long chain of apparently fortuitous circumstances that have led up to this book. Is that interesting to you to note that a book, he's basically suggesting that this book, and any book is going to be the result of some sort of a, as he says, fortuitous circumstance. Because these things take effort. Like I said, composing the written word isn't always easy. So to have something where you put these many words together, somebody worked on that. Somebody spent a lot of time to put down these thoughts and ideas. And so to just pass them off as like, oh, it was written 10 years ago, it was written 20 years ago. Honestly, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me, because they considered it of value, and oftentimes you will still find value in them. But the older something gets, I will grant that the more you have to understand it in its historical context in order to understand what it's trying to express. Some particular thanks are due for long-term friendship and support for the work captured between these covers. Thank you, Linus Torvalds. I don't know if that's a familiar name. He's the Linus of Linux. He's the inventor of the Linux kernel. Thank you, Larry Augustin. Thank you, Doc Searles. Thank you, Tim O'Reilly. Tim O'Reilly. I think that gives the name to the O'Reilly Publishing. You are all people I am proud to call friends as well as colleagues. Most especially thank you, Catherine Raymond, my love, my wife, and my longest time supporter. And looks like he's going to be wrapping up his preface here. He says, I am a hacker. I have been part of the culture described in this book for more than 20 years. He's defining himself. In that time, I have been privileged to work and play with some of the most interesting and exceptional people on Earth, solving fascinating problems, and, on precious few occasions, creating something both genuinely new and useful. Too many of those people to name here have taught me valuable lessons about our shared craft and many other things. The essays in this book are my return gift to them. These essays were stages of discovery for me as well, reports from a fascinating journey in which I learned to see the long familiar in a new and deeper way. Sometimes you find typos. I think this is one. To my then, oh no, it's just a strange construction. To my then and continuing astonishment, the mere act of reporting this journey turned out to have a catalyzing effect on the emergence of open source into the mainstream. I hope the reader of my travel papers will catch some of the excitement of that journey and of the amazing prospects that are unfolding before us today as mainstream business and consumers take their first steps on the same road. So what he's saying there, to my then and continuing astonishment, the mere act of reporting this journey turned out to be a catalyzing effect on the emergence of open source into the mainstream. So what he's saying there, I mean, maybe I've heard the phrase, don't make too much soup out of one oyster, but, anything you do is okay, where was I? So what he's saying there is that, nothing happens in isolation, and neither did this book happen in isolation. Having written these things down, this book subsequently was itself an influence on, what came after it, in the software and technology space, in open source and in closed source, and it catalyzed the discussion around those topics. And that's often the case of things when you write them down, or you communicate them, or you let someone else know what you're thinking. I mean, you can have all the wonderful thoughts in the world, but if they're not shared, they're not actually of any use to someone else. So, and you might imagine, me personally, I'm not clearly not the best speaker here, but I figured, I'm getting something out of these books, and maybe some of you might benefit as well. So if I continue to do this, I'll try to improve my presentation, and hopefully we all might benefit from it. There's some additional notes for the second edition, but I think I'm going to leave that alone, and I'm going to go ahead and maybe do a little editing here, and then put this up. And I appreciate you joining me, and next time, if there is a next time, we'll get into the first chapter. Thank you very much.